Are you a fan of Christian fiction, specifically in the supernatural thriller, fantasy, sci-fi genre? And are you a fan of massive shared universes where there's lots of different series and each book has their own story, but there's also a bigger universe with lots of connections and tie-ins? Well, then I've got your new favorite series. That is the Books of History Chronicles by Ted Dekker. It's an absolutely incredible series with a total of 35 books in it. And today, I want to share with you the perfect order to read the entire series. All right, so to get it out of the way, if you haven't read the series before, I recommend you reading it in this order. First, check out Black, Red, White from the Circle series. Then read Showdown from the Paradise Trilogy. Then read the first 4 books in the Lost Books series. Then jump back to the Paradise Trilogy for Saint and Sinner, and then you get to read Green, the last book in the Circle series, and wrap it all up with the 49th Mystic and the Rise of the Mystics, the Beyond the Circle series. So once again, you have Black, Red, White, Showdown, Chosen, Infidel, Renegade, Chaos, Saint, Sinner, Green, the 49th Mystic, and Rise of the Mystics. That is all you have to read if you are new to this series. However, now that we've gotten that out of the way, now it's time to do the more comprehensive version. I decided to try and figure out what is the perfect reading order for all 35 books. Now, at first, it might seem pretty straightforward, like the version I just gave for those who are being introduced to the series. However, things get really complicated really quickly, because you have Thomas Hunter in the Circle series, who, whenever he goes to sleep on our Earth, he wakes up in a future version of Earth, also called Other Earth. And so we have 2 timelines going. You have our Earth and future Earth. But then, after Black and before Red, you have the Lost Books take place. And that is set during Other Earth's time period. But the last 2 books, Renegade and Chaos, have to take place after the events of our Earth timeline, specifically the books Showdown and Skin. It was a little difficult figuring out where to place everything. Then, of course, you get the timeline reset in Green, which throws everything into chaos. Now, originally, Ted Dekker wrote Green as almost a prequel, where the timeline switch happens, and then that leads into Black and carries on through the story. So all of our books are set in the new timeline. However, what I decided to do, and what I think makes for a much smoother reading experience because of Ted Dekker's later books, specifically Beyond the Circle, I decided to say that we have the events of the Paradise Trilogy, the Circle series, the Lost Books, all the standalone books, those take place before the timeline switch. And then you have after the timeline switch as Beyond the Circle and a handful of other books, which we'll get into. Are you confused yet? Hopefully not. Let's go ahead and try and give a perfect reading order for the Books of History Chronicles. First up, you have Emanuel's Veins. Now, I really don't like having this as first because it's not my favorite book in the series. It's very dark. It feels very different, and the Circle series is my favorite series of all time, so I'd much rather jump into that. But this book is set in the 1700s and acts as a fun way of introducing you to the world and some of the characters, some of the themes, without really giving too much away. It doesn't act as a perfect setup, but it's a way of getting you curious about the world. So you have the shiitake appear, and then you also get some teases about Jane's ancestry, Jane being a character that we meet in Green at the end of the first timeline. And we get introduced to a mysterious character named Vlad, who shows up much later in the series, Even though you would think that Vlad is a standalone one-off character, he's actually more important than you would suspect. All right, now that we get that book out of the way, now it's time to get into the good stuff. For your second book, you have Black, the book that started the entire Books of History Chronicles. The Circle series is my all-time favorite. It's an incredible fantasy series, and Black in particular is just such an incredible book. There's going to be things that if you read it the first time, you're going to miss. All the stuff with Bill and Billy and Billos are pretty crazy considering that he hadn't written any of that yet. However, it sets up a lot while also feeling like its own story. Next up, after the events of Black, we get Chosen and Infidel, which are the first two books in the Lost Book series. Now, this is technically a young adult series that Ted Dekker wrote after he wrote both the Paradise Trilogy and the Circle series. However, both of these books take place before the events of Red, and so I like to read them before I read Red. The next two books technically take place also before the events of Red in Other Earth's timeline. However, they take place later on in the story if you're looking at it from our Earth's timeline, which is confusing, and I really struggled on where to put all four of those books. Some versions of my list had them later on. Some of them had the first three up here, and then the last one later on. Eventually, though, I decided on reading the first two books because those two are set on Other Earth. And then the third book is set in a weird middle ground, but requires the events of Showdown and Skin to really make sense. And then Chaos, which is the fourth book in the series, technically takes place after the events of the Circle series and Showdown and Skin. However, on Other Earth, it still takes place before Red. The timeline gets confusing. So, anyways, then you get back into the Circle series with Red and White. Now, these two take place right after each other, and on our Earth timeline, I'm going to go with 2004 as our official date. All right, the next book in our series takes place in 2020, although not the 2020 you're thinking of, because this was written 15 years before that. Although, ironically, there are still weird virus crazy things and bats involved. Interesting. The next book on the list is Showdown, which is the first book in the Paradise Trilogy. And this is perfectly set after White, because in White, we have the blank books disappear from Other Earth and end up in our Earth. And these blank books end up being the major catalyst for the Paradise Trilogy, specifically Showdown. And then we also get shiitake larvae and are introduced to some pretty major players in the rest of the Books of History Chronicles, including the Love 'em or Hate 'em Billy. We also get a few references to Thomas Hunter and the virus that nearly wipes out all of humanity from the Circle series. And then, of course, you have our infamous Marsuvius Black as the villain in Showdown, who reoccurs throughout the rest of the Books of History Chronicles and creates lots of chaos even when he's not directly appearing. So he's a fun one. Because of Marsuvius Black, we have the next two books on our list, which is House and Skin. Now, both of these books were during Ted Dekker's what I'd call dark phase, where he was writing what you could call Christian horror thriller novels. Both of these certainly lean more into the horror genre, and personally, that is not my type of genre, so I didn't really like the books. They're a little too dark, a little too disturbing. I already wasn't a fan of Mustard, but Skin made Mustard deeply disturbing to me. And that will only make sense if you actually read the book. These two books are directly tied to the books of History Chronicles because Marsuvius Black wrote in the Blank Books. And in doing so, he created these villains. And the strange device used in Skin acts as the perfect setup for Renegade, the third book in the Lost Book series. We also see Marsuvius Black show up again, of course. And we get the introduction of probably the second most infamous villain in all of the books of History Chronicles, and that being Baal. Baal appears a lot in the coming books, as does Marsuvius Black. But Renegade is Baal's tragic origin story, and nothing will be the same because of some choices that are made. Next up, we have Chaos, which is the fourth book in the Lost Book series. Now, this one is set directly after the events of Renegade, but because of all the weird timeline stuff, this is technically still before Red on Other Earth's timeline. However, it is technically set in 2030 on our Earth timeline. So after the events of Showdown and White and Red and all of those books. Our main characters in the Lost Book series actually end up visiting Paradise, Colorado, where the Paradise Trilogy is set, and go to the cabin where the monastery used to be from the Paradise Trilogy. So lots of fun connections there. Plus, we get some more name drops of Thomas Hunter, which is always fun. All right, now that you finished those, it's time to read Saint, which is the second book in the Paradise Trilogy. Saint, we'll say, is set in 2032, and while not my favorite book on the list, it is still pretty good, and Ted Dekker's world building is still incredible regardless of the story. I wasn't a huge fan of how they handled Johnny and some of the other characters from Showdown, but it was still a good book. Then, right after that, you have Sinner, which takes place in 2033. We continue the story of Johnny and Billy and Darcy and some of the other kids from the monastery in Showdown. And of course, Black shows up again. Now, I love this book, but I also really dislike this book because the story is fantastic. However, it sets up some things with Billy that unfortunately get negated in Green. And now we're going to go ahead and jump back into Other Earth for Lunatic and Elion, which are the final two books in the Lost Book series. These are also two books that I tend to skip on my reread because whereas the first four books are fun and engaging and more lighthearted, these last two books are really dark and depressing, especially for a young adult series. However, we see Baal again, and we get to see more glimpses into what life is like on Other Earth before the events of Green when everything gets flipped on its head. Which, of course, leads me to Green, which was originally written to be the very last book in the Books of History Chronicles. Now, obviously, Ted Dekker continued to write them, but this served as the epic conclusion. And we'll say that it is set in 2043. This book was written to be both the end and the beginning, where both worlds end up coming to this apocalyptic conclusion, and we see a ton of connections from all the other books. We get to see Billy again, we get to see the Lost Books again, we get to see the Blank Books, we get to see the Shiitake, and villains throughout all of the books, including one very surprising twist being that Monique ends up having a daughter with a race descended from the Shiitake, meaning that Jane is a descendant of Vlad from Emanuel's veins, which is pretty crazy. Now, this book was fairly controversial. Some people loved it, some people disliked it. I thought that there were some things that were rushed. However, it also was still an amazing book, and it has what I would argue is one of the most vivid scenes in all of fiction. It's hard to complain too much about the book when there's so much to love. But I will complain because the biggest issue I have with this book is Billy. You set up this amazing redemption at the end of Sinner, and then you got rid of all of that and had him embrace his evilness Yet at the same time, the whole thing about Billy being split into two, and there being Bill and Billy, one going after Thomas in our Earth, the other going after Thomas in other Earth, way back at the beginning in Black. That was a pretty good twist. If you're confused, it actually makes perfect sense when you read the book. And of course, you have Bale, who has fully embraced his evil persona, and it's sad and disturbing. Poor Billos. But then, at the end of Green, Thomas Hunter makes a choice. He can either go to eternity, or he can try to save his son, where he loses his memory and goes back to the very beginning in Black and tries to change the story. Now, this was supposed to serve as the introduction and the finale of the series, where all the events that we've discussed so far take place in the new timeline. But then Ted Dekker decided to keep writing, and his new stuff don't really work in the original timeline. So what I like to say is that everything that we've already read takes place in the original timeline, the new timeline being after Thomas Hunter reset everything to try to save his son. Now, all the books in the new timeline are a lot more psychological and spiritual focused versus the more dark and gritty thriller style of the original books. And to kick this off, we have a series that you would not think would be in the Books of History Chronicles, but for some reason are, and that is AD 30 and AD 33. This is Ted Dekker's foray into historical fiction, set in the Arabian world during the events of the Gospels. And our main character does end up meeting Jesus and some other characters we see in the Gospels. Now, the question is, why in the world was this included in the Books of History Chronicles? Not exactly sure, but it does introduce us to the character of Talia, who is a relatively minor character, but is revealed to be a dream traveler like Thomas Hunter. And so he shows up several times in these new books. This series also acts as an introduction to what I'd call Ted Dekker's new theology. During this time, Ted Dekker had a spiritual awakening and got much more theological. Some of his theology are things that I don't necessarily agree with, but they're still interesting, and I think Ted Dekker does a good job of explaining where he's coming from. Now, you might be asking me, wait, what about the Outlaw series? Wasn't that about the kids from the monastery? Correct. That is the case, that we have not touched the Outlaw series. But because of the themes and because the original timeline was already so crowded, I decided to put the Outlaw series in the new timeline. I know that originally it was written to be in the original timeline, but it works so much better with the new one. So for this, we have to presume that at least some things are relatively similar in the new timeline, and where there is still a monastery and a version of what happens in the Paradise Trilogy, specifically in Showdown, still takes place in the new timeline. That brings us to our second book in the new timeline, being Outlaw. This is set in the 1960s and acts as a prequel to the rest of the Outlaw series. But before we can get into the rest, we have to talk about The Dream Traveler's Quest, which is a middle school Christian fantasy series by Ted Dekker that, for some reason, he decided to put in the Books of History Chronicles. Now, because this is for middle schoolers, you can totally skip it on your reading through the Books of History Chronicles. However, they're surprisingly good, and they're very short and easy to read, and pretty fun books as well. This introduces us to the character of Theo, who is revealed to also be a dream traveler like Talia and like Thomas Hunter. And he ends up going to Other Earth, and there's a surprising amount of connections with the rest of the Books of History Chronicles. We get Talia, Maya, and Shadow Man, who shows up again in the Beyond the Circle series. Next up, we have Eyes Wide Open and Hacker, which are two of the books in the Outlaw series. These two follow some of the kids from the original monastery experiment. And interestingly, we have similar technology used in Hacker as used in Skin and Renegade. So it's still all connected. Then we have Dream Traveler's Game, which is book 5, 6, and 7 in the Dream Travelers middle school fiction series by Ted Dekker. These are pretty much standalone. They continue Theo's story, but aren't really connected at all with the larger Books of History Chronicles. Next up, we have The 49th Mystic, which introduces us the character of Rochelle Matthews, and she is revealed to be another dream traveler. She goes to Other Earth, and we see lots of reoccurring characters, such as Shadow Man, who is, surprise, revealed to be Vlad from Emanuel's veins. Not really sure why Ted Dekker threw that in, but it's still fun. And Talia, who is another dream traveler from AD 30 and AD 33. Also, not sure why he's showing up, but still fun. Then we have Waterwalker, which is another book in the Outlaw series. Now, technically, all of the books in the Outlaw series could act as standalone, and so I decided to break the order of release, and I think that this order makes much more sense and is a much more enjoyable read. And then we have Rise of the Mystics, which is the big finale and acts as the other version of Green. While the story mostly follows Rochelle Matthews, we still get to see the new Thomas Hunter and his circle. And this book is specifically the reason why we have to have a whole new timeline, because Other Earth looks very different from what it looked like in White and Green. Clearly, Thomas Hunter made a few choices that are very different from how he did it originally. But it's still great seeing him again and seeing some of our favorite characters from the original series show up in Rise of the Mystics. And this acts as the ultimate culmination. But we're still not done, because lastly we have The Keeper, Forbidden, Mortal, and Sovereign, which are the novels in the Book of Mortals series, which are set in the Books of History Chronicles, but set in a dystopian future on our Earth, but before the events of Other Earth. And this one is directly tied in because a vial of Thomas Hunter's blood from White shows up and is the catalyst for the story in the Book of Mortals series. Now, this one was originally written as a part of the original timeline, but I think that it works much better after the events of Beyond the Circle, because if Green acts as the catalyst of everything turning back, then it doesn't make sense to have a dystopian future and then go back and have a reversal. So this maybe doesn't simplify it, but makes it make more sense, where you have as the conclusion the Book of Mortals series. All right, thank you for enduring with me through this very long video where I try to give you the perfect way to read the entirety of the Books of History Chronicles. Now, there is a lot, and the timeline is very complicated, but what I love about this series is that there is so much going on, and there are so many connections and Easter eggs and tie-ins. Characters that you'd never thought you'd see again are suddenly main characters again. And while some books are better than others, overall the series is incredible and contains some of my all-time favorite books. But as a recap for the perfect way to read the entire Books of History Chronicles, start with Emanuel's Veins, and then go with Black, Chosen, Infidel, Red, White, Showdown, House, Skin, Renegade, Chaos, Saint, Sinner, Lunatic, Elion, Green. And then we have the new timeline with AD 30, AD 33, Outlaw, the 4 books in the Dream Traveler's Quest series, Eyes Wide Open, Hacker, the 3 books in the Dream Traveler's Game series, The 49th Mystic, Waterwalker, Rise of the Mystics, The Keeper, Forbidden, Mortal, and Sovereign. There you have it. All 35 books in the series for you to love and enjoy. Now, if you've read this series, I would love to hear your thoughts. What do you think of my order? Do you like it? Would you reorder it? And which is your favorite in the Books of History Chronicles series? If you haven't read the series yet, then come on, what are you waiting for? You've got so much to read, and you now know where to start. Fingers crossed, Ted Dekker will decide to add a few more books to the series. The new timeline still needs some more books in it to really make it feel full and rich. And if he does, then I'll have to do an update video. But if not, this will serve as your epic, comprehensive look at every book in the Books of History Chronicles and the perfect order in which to read them.